All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this training on ESG compliance. We'll go ahead and get started and be sure to admit folks as they trickle in on Zoom. Today's training is focused on documenting eligibility for rapid rehousing participants. My name is Monica Porter, and I am joined by my colleagues at home base, Sasha Kane and Nicole Thomas. I'll pause so that they can say hello to you as well.
Hi, everyone.
So as I mentioned, we all work at Home Base, which is a nonprofit organization providing technical assistance and training to the Office of Supportive Housing and housing and homeless service providers in Santa Clara County. We are recording this training and we will make the recordings available on the COC website. As I mentioned, we've also sent out the slides for this training at around 9 o'clock this morning. So you should have those in your email as a reference for you. Next slide, please. So this training is part of a series on compliance related to ESG, Emergency Solutions Grants. We're starting our series today with a session on eligibility documentation. Next, on Tuesday, November 10th, we will cover habitability inspections. And finally, on November 17th, we'll talk about eligible costs. If you haven't yet registered for our additional sessions, links to register are in the same email as the link to register for today. So we invite and encourage you to join us for the rest of our series. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover a number of topics related to eligibility documentation. Before we do that, I will provide an introduction to Emergency Solutions Grants. Then I'll turn it over to Sasha, who will talk with you about documenting eligibility under Category 1. And Nicole will talk with you about eligibility reevaluation and record keeping tips. Next slide, please. So a bit of housekeeping, although I'm sure that you're all pretty used to attending meetings and trainings on Zoom by now. You are all muted and we ask that you stay muted. There are a few points in the training when we will unmute you or invite you to unmute yourself, but to cut down on background noise, please leave your mics off for now. If you have any questions during the training or are having any technical issues, please use the chat box and message one of us at home base directly or send a message to everyone. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the training and pausing periodically to address any content questions. As I noted earlier, we are recording this training, but the chat box will not be recorded. To find the chat box, if you're on a computer, you can hover over your screen and a bar similar to the one on the slide should pop up at the bottom with a chat option somewhere in the middle. So let's just pause briefly to do a quick icebreaker to get us started and to help us find the chat. It's been a long day and it's going to be a bit of a longer week. So just wanted to pause to see here, what is your favorite form of self-care, or what is something you like to do just for you? And this is a bit selfish because I'm also looking for some ideas. So if you could just pop into the chat, something that you like to do just for you, just to kind of get us started this morning. I'm seeing running, walking, deep breathing, riding a motorcycle when it runs, loving on my dog, playing guitar. These are awesome. Working out, yoga, bagels, hiking, gardening, baking, working out, listening to music, watching The Mandalorian. I saw the second season's come out. Watching TikTok, working on my car. Awesome. These are great. Working out. Netflix is huge. Absolutely. TV. Those are great. Awesome. Thank you. And it's nice to have everyone together this morning. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are Emergency Solutions Grants, or ESG? ESG is a federal block grant for homeless assistance funding administered by HUD and distributed directly to localities as well as to states who distribute it to localities. HUD distributes federal ESG dollars to states through HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Next slide, please. So ESG funding is a bit complicated. It has many different arms that lead to many different buckets of ESG funding, including this new bucket of funding where HUD's been using ESG funds to respond to COVID-19. Next slide, please. We're not going to get into that. Big, complicated. So on the next slide, we'll show you that today we're just going to be talking about the annual ESG allocation received by the county directly from HUD. And in Santa Clara County, OSH is the entity that receives the funding directly from HUD. Just wanted to show you how it all fits into that system. So in addition to this training, there are a number of resources that provide information relevant to ESG compliance. The first that I'll note is one that is coming soon. The RAPA Toolkit, which stands for Rental Assistance Program Administration, will be coming soon and is going to have a number of resources that will be relevant to this training as well as the rest of our series. Additionally, COC eligibility documentation forms, which we will be referencing later on this morning, the HUD Exchange website. Or if you really want to nerd out like we do at home base, you can go straight to the ESG program interim rule. Or of course, you're always welcome to email home base and we are happy to look into any questions for you. Next slide, please. So just a bit more context to frame our training today. ESG is a homeless assistance program, so only participants who meet one of the defined categories of homelessness or at risk of homelessness can be served by ESG rapid rehousing. Some of this will sound familiar, but just as a quick refresher to get us all on the same page. HUD's final rule defining homeless became effective January 4th, 2012. 4 main categories under which households are considered homeless exist. We're going to focus just on one today. There are specific documentation rules for each of these categories, and when available, third-party documentation is the preferred method to document that, as Sasha will get into further. But before we go on, just to note here, why are we covering eligibility documentation today, and why is this important? It's easier to prevent errors than to correct them. Backfilling documentation is a pain, and worse, it can result in clients being exited from the project. Additionally, for HUD monitoring, this is important to maintain documentation for monitoring purposes. Monitoring findings can impact future funding applications and could result in having to repay grant funds. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are 4 categories of homelessness. Category 1, literal homelessness. Category 2, which is at imminent risk. Category 3, youth. And Category 4, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, today we'll just be discussing Category 1 because this is the only category that's available for ESG rapid rehousing. So to recap on the next slide, for verification of homelessness, a client must fall into Category 1 of literally homeless. And for ESG, there is also an income restriction, which Nicole will talk with you about in just a bit. Last slide for me before I turn things over on the next slide. To document eligibility, there are template forms available on the COC website under COC forms. And as I mentioned, we'll soon be coming out with a toolkit that also has some helpful materials. The 4 forms that are listed on this slide are the only relevant ones for ESG rapid rehousing. There's a homelessness documentation checklist, and then there are 3 forms that help with certification that Sasha will be going over with you. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sasha to talk with you about Category 1.
Thanks, Monica. So this might look pretty familiar at this point, but Category 1 is defined by HUD as a household that lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So these folks can fit into any one of three subcategories or paragraphs, as we'll be referencing them. They might either be living in a public or private place not meant for human habitation, or in an emergency shelter, transitional housing, or a hotel or motel that's paid for by a charitable organization or government program. So this might be kind of like the COVID vulnerable or COVID positive hotels that are in Santa Clara County right now. Also eligible under category one are folks who are exiting an institution after 90 days or fewer, and who immediately before entering the institution were living on streets or shelter. So client files that are documenting this category of homelessness only need documentation to support one of these situations. As Monica already previewed, and as we'll be reiterating throughout the training, third-party verification is always the preferred method for certifying homelessness for someone who's applying to an ESG rapid rehousing program. And the easiest way to get that is to check HMIS, but sometimes maybe there's no record, or maybe the applicant says they stayed at a shelter, but it's not an HMIS participating shelter. So you'd want to, for example, reach out to that program. Or maybe they mention having received services with another organization that's also like not an HMIS. So you'd want to get in touch with that organization to get that third party verification. Staff certification based on intake conversation or self-declaration by client. So those number 2 and 3 that you see on the slide, those are only permitted when you've attempted but cannot obtain third-party verification. So you have to document all your attempts to obtain third-party verification whenever you resort to intake worker certification or client self-declaration. So let's talk about how to document client eligibility for category one. This is a screenshot of a portion of the homeless documentation checklist that's found on the COC website under COC forms. And as we mentioned just now, it has several subcategories. And the one that's on your screen right now is the subcategory where a client is living in a public or private place not meant for human habitation. So this might be a park, an abandoned building, a bus or train station, an airport, a campground. And the form basically guides you by listing different types of acceptable eligibility documentation. And it does it in order of preference. Again, the best is always written third party, and probably the easiest way to document this is to check HMIS for a record of homelessness. And so, for example, an outreach transaction, and print that out and add it to the client file. Other options include a signed letter on letterhead. For example, as we mentioned, if the person has received services from one organization that's not an HMIS, or a completed homeless certification form from a street outreach provider. And at this point, if you've gone through this list and you've exhausted these options, but you haven't been able to obtain third-party verification, you can move to second party, or if needed, first party. Second party documentation requires both the intake staff certification based on your intake conversation with the individual, and again, your attempts to secure that third party documentation. And finally, last resort is that first party documentation, or what folks typically call client self-certification. And here, that's both the client's self-declaration of homelessness and also the staff's, your certification of attempts to secure the preferred third-party documentation. An important thing to note here is that for category one homelessness, unlike what some folks might be used to in terms of chronic homelessness, you actually can't accept community member observations to document category one. So the observations have to be from other service providers. And you'll notice that to document eligibility under this category or this subcategory, you might need one form. So there are a couple template forms that we'll talk through in just a minute that um, can be helpful in making sure that all of HUD's requirements are ticked. So if a homeless street outreach provider is giving third-party verification, if it's not an HMIS, but the outreach provider is giving you that verification, you'll want to use Form A. And we'll get into what those forms look like in just a minute. If the intake staff person is providing that second party certification, so basically I'm doing an intake with someone who's applying for the program, and there's no third party verification, and I'm going to certify based on my intake conversation with his client that they are experiencing homelessness, I'll want to use Form F. And finally, if the client is providing their own self-certification, you'll want to use Form E. So let's visit each of those forms now. This is a screenshot of a portion of Form A, which a street outreach provider would fill out to provide third-party documentation of homelessness, including describing the client's living situation. And here, I just want to underscore that we're really looking for the location and as detailed a description of the living conditions as possible. If HUD comes to monitor, they'll want it to be obvious that the outreach provider really saw the individual in their living situation, and that is obvious from the description. And you want those dates of contact. So this is a screenshot of a portion of Form F. That's the form that a staff person would fill out to provide a second party documentation of homelessness based on an intake conversation. So in this form, we just want to underscore that you don't need exact dates, but you'd want to fill out the form with a month and a year when the applicant experienced homelessness, and basically provide a description of the conversation that you had with the program applicant and why the reason that you believe that they were living in a homeless situation. And since this is not a third party documentation, this is second party. This is based on your conversation with the client. You'll need to document your attempts to obtain the preferred third party verification and sign the form at the bottom. And finally, this is a screenshot of a portion of Form E, which a client would fill out to provide first party certification of homelessness. And similarly, since third party documentation is preferred, the back of this form also requires staff to document attempts made to obtain third party verification and to sign it at the bottom. Any questions so far? Right? If anything comes up, folks, feel free to pop it in the chat. So now that brings us to the second subcategory within category 1, and that includes folks who are living in emergency shelter, safe haven. I see there's a question, as outreach, would I use Form A or Form F? So outreach staff would be using Form A. So that would be to document your encounter with the individual in their living conditions. Form F is only for someone at the housing program. So say you're rapid rehousing intake staff, you're a case manager, this person's was referred to you and they are sitting down with you to do an intake. And unfortunately, there's no There's no outreach contacts, no other form of third-party documentation that you can use. And so you, as the staff at the Rapid Rehousing Program, are certifying that based on the conversation that you're having with this individual, you believe that they're experiencing homelessness. So you're not seeing where they're living. You're just certifying based on the conversation that you're having with them at intake. And so that's for the housing program staff. But for outreach staff, you'd be using that Form A. And something to clarify, so the program case manager, if you are conducting outreach to locate a referred client, so that's not third-party documentation. Third party has to be someone else doing outreach. So it can't be you as the case manager who is locating that person. So that would be a second party. It has to be a third person, literally. Okay. So back to this second paragraph of category 1. These are folks living in shelters, safe havens, hotels or motels with certain funding sources. So we're back to the homeless documentation checklist. And again, that's on the COC website with the COC forms. And to explain the hotel motel situation just a little bit more, in order to qualify, it has to be paid for a charitable organization or a government program specifically for low-income individuals to fit within this category. So if the hotel is paid for by the client themselves, or sorry, for the program applicant, they haven't been admitted yet. If the hotel is paid by the individual themselves, or maybe a family member is paying for it, or a friend, then the household would not be considered homeless. It has to be paid for an organization or a government agency. And again, here the form lists types of acceptable documentation in order of preference. The written third-party options are pretty similar to the previous category. So you would want to look for an HMIS record of a stay in an emergency shelter, safe haven, or a hotel or motel program. Or if that's not available, you would want to try to get a signed letter on letterhead or a homeless certification form from a shelter or safe haven or another eligible provider, or the organization paying for the hotel or motel stay, for example. And if these options are exhausted, then the second party documentation similarly requires both your certification based on the conversation that you're having with the household and also your attempts to secure the third party documentation. So documentation of the steps that you took to look for an HMIS record, to try to get that signed letter on letterhead, to basically walking through the bullets of the preferred documentation. And last resort, first party documentation similarly requires the client self-declaration and the staff attempts to secure third party documentation. And the forms are similar, so I'm not going to dive into them again. You'll be using either Form A or F or E as we just went over in the last section. Okay, so the third subcategory within category 1 applies to clients who are exiting an institution after 90 days or fewer and having entered that institution from streets or shelter. So this slide again has that portion of the homelessness documentation checklist. And to explain the subcategory just a little bit more, the examples of institutions that HUD gives here are jails, hospitals, and inpatient treatment centers. And This subcategory applies only to people who were living on the streets or shelter before they entered the institution. So they wouldn't qualify as category 1, for example, if they entered the institution from a transitional housing program. They have to be coming from streets or shelter. So to document eligibility within this subcategory, you would need documentation both of the institutional stay. So you'll want to have those start and end dates to show that it was 90 days or fewer, and also documentation of homelessness immediately before being in the institution. So to document the institutional stay, the preference is, unsurprisingly, written third-party documentation, and that could be discharge paperwork or a referral from an official at the institution. But either way, it has to include the admission and discharge dates to show that the length of stay was 90 days or fewer. If it's not possible to get third-party documentation of the institutional stay, then the client can provide that self-declaration, and you would want to document your attempts to secure third-party documentation. So that's all to document the institutional stay. To document the client's homeless status right before the institutional stay, it's a similar structure to the previous subcategories. So there are third party, second party, and first party options, with the third party always being preferred. Sometimes you might be using oral statements as documentation. So maybe you're talking to someone on the phone from the institution. And if that's happening, then you would want to document those oral statements in writing in the client's file so that it's all there for monitoring. And you'd want to have the contact information of the person that you were speaking to from the institution. So that could be verified if need be. So that brings us to the recent ESG Mega Waiver. So HUD basically has recognized that folks are residing in institutions for longer periods of time as a result of COVID. So some people are spending longer times in jail due to postponed court dates or court closings or courts operating at reduced capacity. And then other folks are staying longer in the hospital when they're infected with COVID. So basically they're extending that institutional stay cutoff. And they're allowing someone who was residing in a shelter or a place not meant for human habitation before entering an institution to maintain the homeless status for longer than 90 days to prevent the spread of COVID. So until March 31st, 2021, the eligibility cutoff for institutional stays is set at 120 days instead of 90 days. The final subcategory within category 1 is exiting transitional housing. Again, this subcategory has a really similar documentation structure as the others, with the preferred method being third-party verification from HMIS or a signed letter on letterhead or Form A, which we previewed. And if needed, you can provide first-party verification through Form E and the staff supplement describing attempts to secure third-party documentation. However, with this subcategory, there's a split in the type of documentation that's required depending on the client's additional circumstances. So this slide is showing documentation for a client who's exiting transitional housing and was either living on the streets or shelter prior to that, or is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And this part of the checklist includes the documentation requirements for folks who are exiting transitional housing and who did not live on the streets or in shelters and are not fleeing or attempting to flee DV. So I think one question that we get a lot is how can we tell if a client is exiting a transitional housing program. I think the transitional housing program definition can be kind of tricky, and sometimes what's called a THU in Santa Clara County may or may not be a transitional housing program. It might be transitional housing, or it might be emergency shelter, or it might be none of those things. So it can be tricky to see if someone qualifies under category 1, and we can't always assume that a THU is a transitional housing program. So we've developed a decision tree of sorts that can guide providers in figuring out whether the program that the client is exiting is considered transitional housing, or if it's considered emergency shelter, or if it's none of those things. And this will be part of the RAPA toolkit that we mentioned earlier that will be posted on the COC website soon. So just to walk through 2 examples of how to use this decision tree. So the first question that you want to ask is whether the person had a lease or an occupancy agreement. And this is basically to get at if the program's a transitional housing program, because for transitional housing programs, it's required by the definition that the client signed a lease or occupancy agreement. If yes, then you'll want to ask if the primary purpose of the program is to facilitate the household's movement into permanent housing. Transitional housing programs, by HUD's definition, are still housing programs. The ultimate goal to fall under the transitional housing definition should be to stabilize the person in permanent housing. And if that's a yes, then you'll want to ask if there's supportive services that are available throughout the participation in the program. So that's another part of the definition of transitional housing. There have to be supportive services throughout the participation of the program. So if yes, then is the term of the lease or the occupancy agreement at least 1 month and at most 24 months? So anywhere between a month and 24 months, that's what HUD considers transitional housing. And so if yes, then that program falls under the definition of transitional housing, and you'll want to follow the homelessness documentation checklist to document that person's stay. You'll see that this is pretty much the only way to get to transitional housing. If you answered no to any of these questions, then the program is not transitional housing. So I'll give you another example of how this might play out. So if the person didn't sign a lease or an occupancy agreement, then you'll want to, this side of the decision tree is basically to figure out if the program falls under the definition of emergency shelter. So you want to ask if the primary purpose of the program is to provide temporary shelter for homeless individuals. And then you might run into situations where this is very substance use focused program. So is there substance use treatment provided? And in order to qualify under emergency shelter, if there's substance use treatment, then that would have to mean that the treatment services have to be available to unhoused individuals not residing in the program's facility. So the only way for this program to be an emergency shelter is if the services are available both to people who are residing there and to people who are not. If the only way that you can reside in the program, the only way that you can get the substance use treatment services is by residing there, then it's not considered emergency shelter or transitional housing. And I see we have a question. What about those staying in hotels for quarantine purposes, but were not previously homeless? So I think here, I know there were folks who were in crowded situations, in many cases, who are now staying in the quarantine hotels. And um, I think I'll have to follow up on that question. I can't answer it off the top of my head, unless Nicole or Monica, you have an answer.
I don't, but we can look into that one.
We'll follow up.
To wrap up our preview of documenting eligibility under category 1, just wanted to give a note on timing. So the aim of documenting homelessness prior to program entry is to document the night before. So the clients, like they're applying to the program, and the goal is to document that they were homeless the night before they enter. But third-party evidence of category 1 can actually be up to 14 days old. So for example, if someone is entering your program on June 15th, their documented night of homelessness could date back to June 1st. If the homeless certification does not fall within the 14 days of program entry, then you'll have to seek other forms of documentation to establish their status. And I'm going to pause here for questions. And folks, feel free to keep sending them through the chat as they come up, but also just want to give some time if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions, that's also fine. So I know that was kind of dense, so we're going to do a quick practice activity. Jack, so this is just a short hypothetical. Jack presents at your program, and exactly 5 months ago, he was incarcerated, and he's getting out today. Prior to entering the prison, Jack had been camping in a wooded area since he had nowhere else to stay. Does Jack fall into category 1? And I'm going to launch our poll. And folks, based on this hypothetical, does Jack fall into category 1? Give folks just a couple more seconds. I see about half of you have voted. Okay, so we have some yeses, we have 3/4 yeses and 1/4 no's. So here, Jack has actually been in an institution for more than 120 days. So 5 months is at least 150 days. So because he was in an institution for more than 120 days, he actually does not fall into category 1. So, and what if Jack was only incarcerated for 120 days? So what documentation would the case manager provide to document that Jack meets the standards in category 1? Would anyone like to unmute themselves and answer or pop any answers in the chat? Discharge paperwork. Yes. Thank you, Laura. And anything else? Looking for one more thing. Laura has told us how to document the institutional stay. There is one more prong of documentation. Hannah, so doesn't the stay need to be 90 days or fewer? So currently, today we have the ESG Mega Waiver that applies up until March 31st, unless HUD decides to extend it. But right now, the institutional stay can actually be 120 days. Due to COVID, HUD has relaxed the requirement. So, but that's temporary. So that's why we present the 90 days. But right now, temporarily, it can be 120. So if Jack only stayed in the institution for 120 days, as Laura mentioned, he documentation of his institutional stay could come via discharge paperwork from the prison, or it could also be via written or oral referral from an official with dates, with start and end dates. And if that's not obtainable, then a written record of the intake worker's diligence to obtain that documentation and a certification from Jack that he has just exited incarceration and he was only there for 120 days or fewer. And documentation, the second prong of that is documentation of his homeless status up to 14 days before incarceration. So he was living in the woods. So maybe that means maybe an outreach worker interacted with him, but that's kind of unlikely if he was in the woods. So maybe that if that's impossible to get, it might be the certification based on intake conversation. So as Michelle mentioned, Form F. So finally, it could be a self-declaration by Jack. All right, so that brings us to eligibility reevaluation, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Sasha. So I'm going to cover income requirements and restrictions that come into play during the reevaluation for rapid rehousing, and this is something Monica briefly touched upon at the start of the training. Next slide, please. Sorry, my voice is going in and out. An initial evaluation must be conducted to determine the eligibility of each household for ESG assistance and the amount and types of assistance the household needs to regain stability in permanent housing. During that initial evaluation, an income assessment is not required for eligibility purposes. Reevaluation of the program participant's eligibility and the types and amounts of assistance the program participant would need must occur at least once annually for program participants receiving rapid rehousing assistance. So at minimum, each reevaluation of eligibility must, 1, establish that the program participant lacks sufficient resources and support networks necessary to retain housing without that ESG assistance, and 2, that the household does not have an annual income that exceeds 30% of median family income for the area. That would be determined by HUD. So here we see a chart of the AMI for 2020. And if we look at the row that is 100%, you'd see for a family of 4 in Santa Clara County, that AMI would be $141,600. And then if you go down to the 30% row, you see that the AMI is $47,350 for a family of 4. So that's how you'd look at a chart like that to determine it's not exceeding that 30% of AMI. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go over some tips that we've gathered and compiled through talking to providers about what works well for them and talking to people who do HUD monitoring regarding what they're looking for and what makes it easier for them to do a monitoring. Next slide, please. So having organized, user-friendly, and consistent case files are key, both for HUD monitoring, but also to ensure that internal compliance checks can be done with ease. Having a table of contents and tabs and case files means less distractions when monitoring. HUD will be able to find what they're looking for and not have to look through the whole file and potentially find other things that aren't relevant to the monitoring, but raise questions in their head about other things they now want to look into as a result. As far as HUD's concerned, if you haven't documented something, it did not happen. So including as much detail as possible to tell a complete story is essential. So for example, we've been talking about that self-certification form where they document homeless status, and there's a portion of that form that you would fill out to document the steps you took to obtain third-party certification. If you fill out that portion just saying, I attempted to obtain third-party certification and wasn't able to, in this instance, you're saying you complied with the grant requirement, but you aren't showing it by providing detail. You want to provide a complete story of the steps that you actually took, so HUD can see there was a good faith effort to obtain this documentation. Another thing you want to look out for, and something we come across quite often, is that case files will have intake or enrollment dates that are inconsistent across different pieces of documentation in the file. So different people might be filling out different forms, but keeping those dates consistent across is important so you're not presenting conflicting documentation that raises further questions for monitors that then prompt them to search further. Oh, I see we're on the next slide. So now you've utilized all those best practices to have your case files sorry, could we go back one slide? Right, okay, thank you. So now you've utilized all those best practices to have your case files tell an organized and as complete a story as possible, and you find your eligibility documentation is not compliant, or you find a gap in your documentation. What do you do? Oh, there's a question.
That's just me, sorry.
Gotcha. So what do you do if you find either this gap in documentation? So we recognize that this happens sometimes. You'll just want to make sure you're addressing it. So you'll want to do an assessment of what the gap or issue is and what's out of compliance, and understand what you need to do to become compliant. And if you can, work on a plan to bridge that gap and bring your documentation into compliance. It can be really helpful, and we strongly recommend reaching out to the Office of Supportive Housing. They have a lot of experience dealing with eligibility documentation and compliance gaps, so they can be really valuable there. And once you've reached out, got the resources you need, and understand what the problem is and have developed a plan, you want to then execute that plan and fix the problem for as many clients as possible. In some cases, we really recommend reaching out to the HUD field office, letting them know what the issue is and the steps that you're taking to address and prevent reoccurrence if necessary. If necessary, the Office of Supportive Housing will do this as the direct HUD ESG recipient. Now, these circumstances may vary, so you might not need to reach out to the HUD field office every time, but particularly in instances where there have been substantial or expansive lack of compliance, it can be helpful to reach out to them ahead of time so they're not hearing about it for the first time at monitoring. Next slide, please. So what do you do if you find the gap in documentation? You've done your best to try and backfill, but you just can't document the client's eligibility. Maybe the client was actually ineligible when they were first enrolled, or maybe too much time has passed and you can't adequately backfill that documentation. In those circumstances, it's important to take immediate action, which can include working with the household and the COC to develop an alternate plan to transition out of the program. Now, everyone's goal is to keep the client from becoming homeless again. This is not a situation where if they're ineligible, you exit them immediately from the program. You'll want to reach out to the Office of Supportive Housing, and if you have any other resources, those can come into play, and work with the household to help them transition to those supports. You want to ensure that documentation you have in the meantime is as accurate and complete as possible. I really want to underscore that exiting a client in any way is a last resort if you can't fill in the gaps of the documentation. Next slide. Do we have any questions regarding these two sections or anything we've covered during this training?
Nicole, it looked like there was a question in the chat a couple of chats ago regarding AMI. Does the number of household members include both adults and children, or only adults that are making income?
It does include children. So that household is adults and children. Thanks.
And I put this in the chat, but I just want to go back to Michelle's question since I misread it. Michelle was asking about folks staying in a hotel for quarantine purposes who were previously homeless. So if that person or household is in the hotel for quarantine and was previously homeless, they would qualify for category 1 if it's, for example, one of the county hotels and the county's paying for the stay, or if there's another nonprofit organization program for low-income individuals is paying for their stay. However, if they were homeless but families paying for the hotel for quarantine purposes, or a friend, or they're paying for it on their own, they do not qualify under category 1.
I'm seeing a question on where you can find the PowerPoint to be able to refresh. I sent out the PowerPoint before the training, but we're also going to send out the slide deck along with additional resources following the training. So you'll have it, and it'll be posted on the COC website. We encourage anyone to continue typing in your questions, but also feel free to unmute yourself and ask some questions too. Could we actually advance one slide? So along with asking us questions right now, we really encourage you to at any point reach out to us through this email address with any questions you have, and we'd be happy to look into it and help you with that. If there aren't any questions, we do ask that I'm going to be sending out a survey by email, but also I've popped it in the chat right now. We'd really appreciate if you took a couple of minutes to fill it out. I can assure you we look through every single survey response we've ever received, and it really helps us inform and adapt our trainings in the future so that it's most helpful and beneficial for you guys. So, thank you very much. That's all I had to cover.
Great. So thank you again to everyone for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time and attention. As Nicole mentioned, please do feel free to continue to be in touch, and we will end the recording in just a moment, but hang out on Zoom if anyone has any additional questions. And as Nicole mentioned, if you could please fill out the survey, we'd really appreciate your feedback, and we will be sure to send out the slides again over email. Thank you so much.